Welcome everyone to the first Lunch and Learn of fall 2022. It's a very exciting day for that. And we're really looking at thinking about a theme for our fall. We were able to find an article about the misconceptions of online learning. It's actually highlighted in the August newsletter as well from CCIT. If you want access to the entire article, we're going to be talking about misconceptions of online learning that are highlighted within that article and really diving deeply into them during our fall Lunch and Learns. And the first one, the first misconception that's stated in that article is all about group work and talking about how group work is so difficult in online courses. So what we want to talk about in this Lunch and Learn is kind of how can we debunk that misconception, right? And try to make it seem more approachable. So we'll just go ahead and dive right in. There we go. So this is Lunch and Learn with Laura and Karianne, and we are so happy that you're here. We're kind of co-hosting this fall, and we look forward to working with you. So we're going to start off. Here's our agenda. The things that we're going to talk about in our brief lunchtime together today is online group work, generally kind of that discussion of what is it and how are we approaching it. Looking at D2L as a tool, and we'll go real briefly through how do you set up groups in D2L. But if you need a deeper dive into that, we do have resources for you, or you can contact either one of us individually and we'll help you out with that too. But we really want to spend a lot of the time talking about discussion boards and how you can use those to support your group work, and thinking about some projects and really kind of the considerations of projects to help further that group work. Karianne.
Yeah, so what I want us to start thinking about now is some of the challenges either that you have experienced or that you predict could happen when you are thinking about using groups online. So, take a minute and in the chat, maybe share with us some experiences that you've either already had or might predict that you might have, something, maybe a negative or a challenge related to online group work. No one participates. Yes. Unequal effort. In Zoom classes, students only participate when I join the breakout. Yes.
Look, she's here. We should talk.
I'm glad you guys are not backing. I'm not shy about this. I will say something that I've seen students struggle with is figuring out timing. Some of our courses will have, a larger group project, and, thinking about when do they meet, when do they get their work done. Typically, there's kind of this pre-work that has to be done before the students actually do their work, maybe a little research or something, and making sure that that timing all fits so that they can end up with a final project that is cohesive can be really, really difficult. Chala shared students struggle with how to connect with each other. Certainly, I think, 2.5 years of COVID have really put a damper on many of our social skills. And it can be hard then for students to even really know how to interact with others.
Well, and I was kind of thinking more about their timing. Like they all have varied schedules too. That's why they're taking online courses. So trying to find common times where they can meet and have a conversation of any type is a challenge for them.
Yes, no, I agree.
And Charlie, you get kind of a gold star for that one too, because you give a great segue into our next Lunch and Learn is going to be all about some extra tools too, in addition to like D2L, some other ways that you can help students learn how they can collaborate. So thanks for that segue.
Because we do really have to provide that. We understanding that our students are not just students, they are also parents and employees. And so if we are going to ask them to create a paper or project or some other, output together, then we really need to provide them the tools that they can use to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to get this right out of the way, groups in D2L. So we're kind of talking about what do we do with it? How do we make this work? We're going to dive into that. The first part is really thinking about what are your reasons for using groups. So we're not saying just use groups because, oh, we should use groups. I know I ought to use groups, really trying to determine that purpose behind it. So one of those reasons might be for building community. For instance, in some of your courses, it's been recommended that you have almost like a water cooler area, right? A discussion board where students can go in and ask each other questions. But research has shown that there's not a lot of times that students will take advantage of that. So some of the recommendations are that you could post a question in there to help kind of jumpstart that conversation. For instance, if exam 1 is coming up and there's a tricky area for students, most times you've taught it for a few semesters, that this is an area that students particularly struggle with. You can point that out in the water cooler area. You can say, by the way, we have exam 1 coming up. This is typically this particular topic, I don't know, photosynthesis, I'm making something up, is something that is a difficult concept for students every year on exam 1. So what are some ways that you can make sure that you understand photosynthesis, or how might a person understand photosynthesis? And then they can start to kind of put some ideas in there. You might put a direct reference to that question in your announcements to help kind of point them in that direction. By the way, in the water cooler area, there's a topic about a tricky part of exam 1. It gives them a purpose for going there and a reason for interacting, and kind of helps them see, okay, I understand how I can use this space then. So that's one way. Building community is also, kind of those introductory discussion boards that you have where we're learning about each other. We're learning, and that was what Karianne was referring to, how sometimes students have that difficulty in that side of connecting, feeling comfortable with each other, and also feeling connected to the instructor. That those are other ways to help build that community. Your purpose might also be for opening doors. Now, this is something I'd like to kind of pose for you, because this is an opportunity for all students to join in the conversation. So even if you have an in-person course or a hybrid course, you could still find value in these discussion boards for small groups in D2L. And the reason why is because we know no matter what modality we're learning in, even in the Zoom, we have some students who talk and some who don't. And there are lots of reasons why they might feel a little introverted, a little shy. They might have different reasons for feeling that way too. Maybe they're a second language learner, so they're not quite sure how to put their thoughts into English. They need to really think about it to feel like they've communicated clearly. You might have a student who has maybe a little bit of a processing delay that could be, for lots of reasons, one of which could be they're new to the content. So they're really just trying to wrap their brain around it, and they don't want to feel like their statement is silly or something like that. If they're able to respond asynchronously in a discussion board, that means they have time to compose their answer. They have time to really put their answer in words that they think make sense. And additionally, you can also use these discussion boards because sometimes in person or sometimes in your Zoom room, you might have a really good conversation going and class ends, or you need to move on to the next topic. And it's a great way that you could direct students to the discussion board so they could carry on that conversation. So it's just recognizing what your purpose is and then communicating that purpose with the students as well. If you have a design that you'd like them to post initially, and then you'd like them to also reply to 1 or 2 other students, telling them why, so that they understand that it's really for that communication, for that rich interactions, or if you're doing it to build community or to open doors for students, letting them know that this is why I'm asking you to do discussion boards. It's not a torture device. It's something that I really feel helps us learn, and having those conversations with your students helps them recognize the value also of the tool. So I just wanted to show you just for a minute creating groups, but let me poll our group first. How many people know how to make a group in D2L? Because that also helps me know how quickly I ought to go. So you can put a Y in the chat for yes, or an N for no, or you can raise your hand, do the Queen Elizabeth wave, something like that if you want. I see a yes. I see a yes, a yes. I've noticed a feature. Oh, okay. All right. Excellent. All right. So what we'll do is we'll go through it, but we'll go kind of quickly. And then Robin, if you want a deeper dive, let me know. I have like a video you can watch on your own time, or you and I can meet and we can do it a little more deeply too. Okay. All right, here we go. So let me show you this. I'm just going to verify. Can you see my D2L page now? Excellent.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to go ahead. We're going to go into activities. This is the quickest way to get into it for me anyway. And so you go into activities. I'm sorry, tools. Tools is actually faster than activities because activities doesn't take you there. So go to tools. All right, so under tools is groups. So if you click on tools and groups, then you'll see that you have this opportunity to create new ones. You will create a new category for your group. So this could be, it could be long-term group project. It could be, like long-term blah, blah, whatever it is, something like that you're trying to categorize this group. This description part, it really is for your purposes. So if you have maybe 3 groups, one is based on discussion boards, one's for your long-term project, and maybe one is for your, your capstone. I don't know what things you have going on in your class, but you might want that description just to help you when you're looking at these. I'm going to say this is for you, and then you'll be able to see where that appears. However, you can make it for the students if you want to give them more description about this group. I'm scrolling down to the bottom, it says make category and group descriptions visible to group members. If you check that box, then they can also see the description. Otherwise, it's just for you. I'm going to scroll back up, and underneath that description box is the enrollment type. There are several different types of groups that you can choose. You can say, out of my 30 students, I want groups of 3. You can say, out of my 30 students, I want 4 groups. You can say, and you can also let the students self-enroll, which can be useful. You might want to let them self-enroll based upon, who likes cats, who likes dogs. You can say who is interested in this human rights article versus who is interested in this human rights article. I mean, you could think about whatever purpose you have in your course, that self-enrollment might be something that you like to use, and you can cap the number of students. So, first come, first serve, 3 students get to be in this group, something like that. I'm just going to go to the groups of number. And plus, I did want to point out this little descriptor, number of users changes depending upon what you've chosen. Now it says number of groups. So that kind of helps you know which one you chose also. I'm going to go ahead, number of users. I'm going to say I'm going to put 3 students in each group. Then this does give restricted enrollments too. Normally, if you haven't made groups yet at all, it's just going to show your course. The benefit of choosing it is if you choose your course, it automatically puts that into this group prefix, if you like that. If you don't like that, you could put something else in there. Maybe it's advanced bio, I don't know, whatever it is. But maybe you have something else that helps you know what that group name is. Then this is a feature that I do like here, auto enroll new users. So if you're creating this, you're pre-planning these groups, and then you get a new enrollee just before the end of enrollment, right? If you check this, D2L will automatically put them into a group for you, and you don't have to worry about how you're going to do it. If you don't, then you can assign them to a group. It's okay, but they might float there for a minute if you miss them. And say, oh, I don't see a group, so you decide what helps you. And it depends on your purpose for using the groups. If you've chosen to enroll students based upon, maybe you gave them a survey and you found out information about them and you grouped them by like thinkers or by different thinkers, then you might have a reason that you want to place somebody. So that just shows you. Real briefly, I'll just show you, you can set up a discussion area right from here that goes with your groups, and it will set up a different discussion area for each group. Lockers, we don't play with too much, but you can also, if you want a separate assignment. And what it does is you can have an assignment, but it's given to each group separately. Mm-hmm. So you can do this. So anyway, if I hit save, it gives me this message that says your groups are currently being created in the background. It might take a few minutes, and you receive notification when this is complete. And all you have to do is say, okay. When you go back to this area, then you'll be able to see, so my long-term blah, blah, it's still forming. They don't know what to do yet with it because there were enough students in the class. If I hit refresh, it'll show up because I don't have too many students in my class. The larger your class is, the more time it takes. But then you see how I put that advanced bio, put advanced bio 1, advanced bio 2. So that was where the prefix worked. So that depends on what you want them to be named there. And you can see that my enrollment in my class, I have 10 students because I have 3, 6, 2, and 2. But D2L tried to even that out, and it didn't put a single student in one group all by themselves. So far, so good? All right, excellent. Okay. So if you need a deeper dive than that, please reach out. And again, we have resources, and Karianne might even drop in there the link for, there's an old Lunch and Learn about groups in D2L. And just after I tell Karianne to, or ask her to drop in a link, this is her slide. So look at that. Yes. I'm giving her so much to do.
So as we're thinking about this, how do you feel about using groups? How, the question, Laura phrased it so positively. How inspired are you to use groups, or how are you inspired to use groups? Thinking about your courses, and again, just take a minute, to think about it and maybe share in the chat how you might use groups in your courses now or in the future, in a future time when you have more time on your hands.
And you feel free to unmute too if you don't want to type. It's okay. We are open to options here.
I'll unmute.
Okay.
So I teach SSC 100, the first year seminar. So because of the nature of the course, like breakout rooms, I think would be good to encourage discussion on some stuff, but I'm not sure honestly how I could do a group assignment, because SSC isn't quite set up for group assignments. It's more class discussion, and then like the individual, like we have the capstone goal setting project. So I mean, I definitely would not put that as a group assignment, but I think in other courses, I think that it has merit, but I'm not sure how I could use the group in the SSC 100.
Well, and I was thinking, possibly you could do something like, in the intro discussion for that, I'm teaching that course too. So I'm not like weirdly familiar with all the courses. In the intro discussion for that course, you ask about, the very basic, like what are people majoring in? So, you could kind of then put people in groups based on that. Like if you had, several people in allied health or several people in like automotive tech, you could kind of group them that way and have them share maybe, some, aspirations that they have, some questions that they have, so more of a discussion, less of an assignment. Okay. Or, we talk about like time management and organization and stuff like that. And you can kind of group students based on, what they might want to work on, procrastination, study skills, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And again, just give them more kind of opportunity to talk, and then as the instructor, you could kind of, pop in with resources that Del Tech has for those things.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea.
That might be something.
Well, and there's also the ability that you can send messages to specific groups of individuals too. So when you're using the messaging opportunities in D2L, for instance, how Karianne was talking about, if you grouped by major, then there may be some particular things that had come up that you can say, oh, well, here's the advisor for, or here are the advisors for that area. I mean, or alphabetically, however it worked. But you can pop in some resources, or here's the chair, or here's a resource that I found for you. If students were saying, for instance, they were having trouble with technology, something like that, you could pop in there the Learning with Technology link, or for instance, that virtual support link with, the Zoom. Well, anytime if you need help and you can't reach someone, you can't reach me, I'm your instructor, but maybe it's sometime, or letting them know that D2L help is available 24/7 and being able to give them that link so that if they can't reach someone at D2L, there's still some support available for them. That those are different ways, and you can send that out to group specific things or to the small groups. And it's interesting too, because even though the SSC groups, how large are they usually? The enrollments?
So it's sometimes it depends on the class, but there's usually 20 seats per section.
There's a lot of research that shows too that when you allow students to be in smaller groups too, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, it helps them feel more comfortable with that sharing as well. So even if they have the same question in every single one of the groups, but they only have 4 or 5 people to interact with, you have some students who are more likely to reach out or contribute to that conversation. And then as Karianne, when she had mentioned that side, that kind of social emotional connection, that side, that then that little cohort of students actually may continue on together, offering that support to each other. So you might plant a seed for a friendship to start too. You don't have to feel responsible for that. And maybe it's only for your course, but it might play out further, and you can have good warm fuzzies over that too.
Yeah, no, I like that. Actually, I only think about like the groups in terms of like an actual assignment, but I do like the idea of like, here is your group and this is your safe space of like-minded people or something like that. I like that. I think that's a really great idea.
Oh, good. And especially for those, SSC is typically students who are new to the college also. So it helps them find someone, and so that's nice. Let's go on to the next part. We are going to get into the meat of this. Are you ready? Everybody's ready. Woo! Yeah, I can tell. Okay. So we're going to talk about discussion boards, and really we're going to talk about 5 different parts of the discussion boards. We're talking about our goals for those discussion boards, why we're doing it. We're talking about the prompt, how we're developing a good prompt to help with that communication. We're going to look at student motivation. Why are we even participating in this thing? We're going to look at instructor expectations, how you can communicate those. And then what do you have to do for the discussion board? What's your role in it as the instructor? So those are the 5 things we're going to look at. By the way, I did want to peek at, or Karianne, do you want to summarize a couple of the other things that were in the chat real quick before we move on about their inspirations? Because I didn't want to lose those ideas.
Sure. So one of the notes Robin said, for now, she wants to know more to help programs who are trying to design assignments for use in assessing CCC3 collaboration for SLOA. So that would be more of like the assignment focused, right, Robin? And then Amber said she's interested in using groups when she has time to incorporate into her classes. It's great to help students collaborate. And then Chala said she's hoping to have the faculty, all the business faculty, use groups more frequently. So I think definitely there's a lot of interest in how can we use groups, effectively.
And when you create groups in a shell, for instance, it can be carried over into your new courses. The enrollments are dropped. The students don't come over with them, but the structure, the skeleton of it can come. So that you don't have to recreate it every time. You can edit it, or you can create it as I demonstrated for you. Let's go ahead and jump into this. So let's think about your goals. We talked about building community already because we're trying to develop that social presence, that sense of conversation. And it's not just for your students, it's also for you. Research shows that especially in your online classes, your students want to connect with you the most. Yeah, they like their fellow classmates or whatever, but most of them have their own lives, they have their own friends, they have their own families. They want to connect with you because you are the expert. You are the one who's representing that networking or that pathway to knowledge. So they really want to connect with you in those online courses. The in-person courses, the hybrid courses, well, then you might see some of those student connections gaining a level of importance for those. But still, you are the hub, you are the keystone that helps build that community. It cannot be built without you. You have to have a part in it. You also might have a goal for discussion boards of learning by explaining, for instance. So you might recognize that students, they get a deeper understanding when they have to explain their learning. And maybe that's your purpose for the discussion board is anything that you're asking, any prompt, for instance, when you're presenting something to them, you're really wanting them to be able to communicate about that topic because that deepens their understanding. And the final one on this slide is about real world application. So whenever possible, helping your students see how does what I'm learning affect my intended profession or affect my operation in the world. And it's really helping them get that connection. And by the way, there is this little link to this article up here. We'll be able to share this with you. But we have this encouraging productive online discussions article that can serve as a good resource for you. And Karianne, if you can capture that link, you can pop it in there for them too. You might have to go to your copy of this presentation.
Right.
And you want to think about the prompt. So I think sometimes we fall into the trap of answering a prompt that just doesn't promote discussion. So sometimes it's a mini assignment, you write your 1 or 2 paragraphs, you have 2 or 3 citations, and there's really nothing anyone can say about it. I mean, and they're all pretty much saying the same thing. It's kind of boring for you too, as the instructor, because you're like, okay, there we go, check, and it's trying to come up with something that really triggers that back and forth or that response to each other. I was taking an online class, and I hate to say it. I mean, we had our initial post that was due, and then we had to respond to 2 or 3 others, but they didn't have to be 2 or 3 other different people. It could be the same person 3 different times and 3 different conversations. But we maybe the instructor meant something else. But my problem was there was one other person in the course who we really responded to each other, and we'd respond to each other with, well, what about this? Did you think of that? And we really challenged each other, and it made it exciting to participate in the discussion boards. If we didn't have those opportunities, if we didn't have the right kind of topics to do that, it was kind of boring. And you were just checking a box. And what you really want to try to do with these prompts is present them as something that's open-ended, that encourages responses, but still is focused on your topic. So that way they don't go down a rabbit hole someplace else, really helping them continue to be focused on your particular topic, whether it's in the math world. So how would you solve this problem? And you present an image, and now they're talking about how could they solve the problem, or what are 3 ways you could solve the problem? And then the reply to people is, which one of those 3 ways do they think makes the most sense for them? There might be different kinds of responses to that. And again, you want it to be relatable to the students. So giving them that real world application. Sometimes scenarios work for this. For instance, in the nursing world, if you had a hesitant patient come in who you needed to administer, I don't know, or take blood, let's pretend, I don't know. I'm making stuff up because I'm not in nursing. And so please, I hope I don't offend anyone. But so let's say it's a reluctant patient that you need to take blood. Well, maybe what's the difference if they're an elderly patient or if they're a child? And what are the different approaches you might need to take with that versus those 2 situations? Those are ones that can begin to have some kind of discussion. And there's probably recommendations in the research or in the course. And they're trying to talk about, well, which way do they think would be most effective for which age group, or for a pregnant woman versus, a burly football player, whatever. So those are some different things to think about. Any thoughts so far?
Well, and I was just going to add, I think it's really important to think about, why is a discussion post different than an assignment? We see a lot of courses here, in CCIT as we're going through things. And, if one of the things that came up when we were talking about Turnitin was that, faculty said, well, can we use Turnitin for discussion board posts? And you cannot, because D2L is not set up that way. But it's also a question of, discussion board posts should be different than assignments where you're going to be thinking about plagiarism and stuff like that. Like, you really want that flow of thought, and you really want people exchanging ideas. And are your discussion board posts set up to do that? And it's hard. It's easier to just say, what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War or something. I don't know. I mean, actually, that might be a good discussion board post. But I'm trying to think of a history one. Like, explain 3 times when the First Amendment is important. Like, that doesn't really engage, discussion. But something like what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War, that can really give you, some more interesting things to read and some greater understanding for students, and it can spark that discussion a little more. So just thinking about for the prompt, what makes this different than just a regular assignment can kind of help you to get to those more interesting and, discussion boards that are going to hopefully spark more conversation.
Excellent. And encourage that, that back and forth.
Right.
When we look at, now we need to also think about our student motivation. So I know that we saw some of the problems with students just don't want to participate, right? And some of that was in group discussions. For instance, you were talking about in breakout rooms, but even in the discussion board, sometimes you find that maybe their responses are checking a box and they're just doing it because that's what they have to do. One of the considerations you need to have is it worth the time? So Miranda was talking about a course with 20 students in it. If you require an initial post for that, then you could have students reading up to 19 other posts at that time to determine which one they would like to reply to. And then if you're requiring 2 or 3 replies, then think about exponentially how much more that is if you have a student who reads them all. Right? Otherwise, you usually have ones that they respond to one of the first 3, and those are the ones that get heavy responses, and the other ones that you have to scroll down further, they don't get as many responses just because they're further down the page, right? Sometimes that happens too. So when you're thinking about worth the time, trying to think about the assignment, if you're assigning the discussion boards and having some kind of parameter set, and it is recommended in the articles that you do have some parameters set that help students really set the priority or the importance of it. But then recognizing if it goes too far, if you're too didactic, if you tell them this, and the rules feel like this, it feels less like a discussion and more like just I'm checking a box that I finished it. But if there's a way to, again, you're talking about that purpose, really setting that purpose. Why do I want you to participate in this discussion board? And we do have discussion board templates that are available in D2L that help guide you to talk to the students. What do I want you to do? Why do I want you to do it? Can help you through that as well. And you can use those for creating your discussion board posts as well. So investigate those. If you need help finding them, reach out and let us know. We'll help you find them. But they are under the content templates. When you go to think about worth the time, when students feel like it's really an engaging prompt, the one that we just talked about, if they're really good prompts, then it's going to feel like it's worth the time and they're going to want to be able to read it. If you have some kind of points attached to it, but again, remember what I was talking about, kind of that exponential difference that you start off with 19, but then who knows, you end up with 125. Is it only worth 5 points? Well, then that's not proportionate to the task. So it's also deciding that, and maybe you don't grade every discussion board. That might be a department decision. I'm not sure how you're handling those, but maybe there are 2 or 3 during the duration of the course that you think are the most powerful discussions that you could possibly think of. Those are the ones you're going to assess. And the other ones are supporting the conversation. You can also think about that. And again, those small groups that we talked about, that in that group of 20, 30, 40, if you're reducing the number of students who are participating in those group discussions, that is how they're developing that safe space. They're developing that kind of close connection with with other students within that smaller group of 4 or 5, and they don't have to read 19 posts and then figure out how to reply. But if you only have a group of, say, 4, 5, 6, maybe there's an initial post and 1 reply, because it's hard to reply to 3, when there's only 4 people in the group anyway. So, it's trying to think about kind of that proportionality. And then you can also think about roles. So this was an interesting thing that I stumbled upon here, thinking about roles. I've used roles in my class for lots of different things, but this is an interesting part of this group idea. And it can be housed in discussion boards, or when Miranda was talking about those breakout sessions, maybe it works there too, because you have kind of that facilitator who starts off the conversation, gets everyone going. Maybe they're the first contributor. You actually have a role. You must be first, something like that. But you can also have someone who's the questioner. So they're the ones who are posing those questions that are, but what about this? Well, what if this happened? And their purpose is to play, I don't know, kind of that devil's advocate, that, well, what about if this was different? And their whole purpose is to come up with those challenges. You might also, and this is something that is a concept that I think is really interesting, you might have an equity role also. So they're making sure that they pull in those other members. If you're using a smaller group of, say, 5 or so, that's real easy to do, to say, hey, Chala, what do you think? I haven't seen anything from you yet. What do you think? And then Chala feels invited to the conversation. If you're in a big group of 20, it's harder for that equity manager to really find everyone anyway, to be able to invite them to the conversation. So that's another purpose for those smaller groups. And each of these things can help contribute to that student motivation, that they will have that desire to be engaged. Well, I feel like it's worth it. It's worth my time, whether that's the points or the value of the prompt, the engagingness of the prompt. I'm in a small group, so my contribution matters. They're going to notice if I don't contribute, and then maybe have those roles to help you, because we're all adults here. We can help encourage everyone to participate. Then you want to be very clear about your expectations. So I kind of alluded to this before. Will it be evaluated? So are there going to be points, assignments? And again, you don't necessarily have to assess every discussion board. Maybe you do have a weekly discussion board, but you're only assessing 3 out of the 7-week or the 15-week course. Maybe each discussion board lasts 2 weeks, because we do know our students have other responsibilities, many of them. So maybe the first week is your initial response, and the second week is your reply. So that way it gives them just a little bit more time to respond as well, to help with those conflicting schedules, the people who might have a sick child at home, things like that. But again, if you're going to evaluate it, consider a checklist, a rubric, some other description of what you're expecting, because then your assessment of it has also makes sense for the student, and they know what's expected of them to begin with. Share that checklist, share that rubric with them early so that they can meet your expectations and they can know how to contribute. That takes me into those discussion protocols, which sounds so clinical, I don't know. But what it really means is this might be your 3 or 4 paragraph description of what you're expecting in those discussion boards. This might come from that template that I talked about, that I referred to, or it might be part of something in your getting started. When we're doing these discussion boards, this is what we expect. You need to contribute to the conversation. I agree is not a contribution, something like that. Merely saying, oh, that's a good idea is not a contribution. You must further it with a question or a direct response to someone's answer. Those are ways, but you're helping the students understand through that checklist, through that rubric, and through your description that, by the way, I'd like to challenge you. It'd be really great if you added audio or video that also explains what you're expecting for those discussion protocols for the student who gets lost in those 3 or 4 paragraphs of reading. So that way they have kind of a difference of learning exactly what your expectations are. And then you may consider having a discussion on etiquette conversation. So how do we disagree politely? And how do we present conflicting ideas? And I put in there a link, and Karianne might be able to go ahead and drop that in the chat for us. there are about 15 things on that netiquette. You might not find all of them applicable. It's really just there for inspiration, to give you some ideas of how you might have this conversation with students. Especially, I mean, if they've been used to just, I don't know, texting people and snapping people, this is an academic discussion. It's a little different. And we might have some different expectations from them of how they would participate. Are there any thoughts out there about setting expectations? Anything that you've done in the past with your discussion boards that you think that I missed, or that can elaborate on these things?
The only thing I don't think you mentioned that we have in a lot of our discussion boards is kind of clarifying what doesn't justify a response. Like good job isn't going to cut it for a discussion. So letting students know, like, maybe when you give those parameters, like what also doesn't meet the expectation.
That's a great idea. Kind of an example of what does meet and examples of what does not. That's a great idea. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, April put in the chat about modeling by the instructor as well as a good way to establish expectations. So in those, and you don't have to respond to every person's every discussion board, but in the beginning, maybe if you have an introductory discussion board that you model how you want students to respond. So you respond in complete sentences, you provide, resources or ask questions. So that way you can show them kind of what you want them to do.
And April and Karianne get gold stars this time. Go ahead, Chala. I don't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to kind of agree with Karianne. Like, I really like to see the instructors chime in and facilitate that conversation with students, because that, I think it validates student, writing. Like, the students like, oh, they are reading it, and that is a good point. So I think it's just another good way that an instructor can give feedback to the students.
Ooh, and Chala chimed in for that gold star too. That's her second gold star today, because that leads us into the next conversation, the next part. I love this, because we want to think about that instructor participation. What do you need to do? And at the beginning, especially in those SSC courses, right? Those really beginning, or maybe your math 101s, your psych 101, something like that, those really initial courses, you want to practice those discussions and do it in something that's a low stakes situation. And I think a lot of instructors do that when they have maybe that introductory discussion board where students go and they share something about themselves. This is your opportunity to practice with the technology and your students as well. Maybe you want to challenge them to pop a video in there, because in your discussion boards, you can have that video response and they can see what that looks like and how that works. Or maybe just an audio is okay, because once you use the video in D2L, you realize it doesn't have a filter like Zoom does. And whoa, those, the look is different, So, I mean, maybe you give them that opportunity to share in any of those ways, because it's that chance to explore the technology. It's that chance to really feel comfortable with it before you want them to move on to those higher stakes opportunities. And then your discussion post responses, or that initial post by you, it's really giving them, again, that good modeling. But as Karianne was saying, you don't have to respond to every student. So you don't necessarily have to be complete in your list. If there are 20 students in your course, you do not have to respond to all 20 students every week. But you might say that in your instructor information page or in your instructor communication expectations, where you're telling them, I'll respond to you within 24 or 48 hours, or you're saying email is the best way to contact me. You might say, and I will be participating in the discussion posts, and I'll be responding to students, but I might not respond to everyone. You can even be as transparent there. So then but I'm going to tell you this, if you respond to 18 of them, you need to respond to 20 of them. So don't leave 2 out. But if you respond to, 3 or 4 or 5, whatever, then that's good. And you do want to do it frequently. And I have seen a mathematical equation, which is really interesting, with a recommendation. If you have 20 students or more, maybe even 15 or more in your course, you are going to want to respond even more frequently. Because think about, you have all these students, there's just different times that they're going to be responding. Versus if you only have, if you have a small course, 6 to 10 students, sometimes they go with that small of enrollment, then maybe you only need to respond 2 or 3 times a week. But you want to respond frequently enough, as Charla had indicated, that the instructor's there. They're part of that conversation. Remember how I said you're that keystone? They want to know that you're there. You can't just be the wizard behind the curtain, right? They want to know that you're a real person and that you're listening. And then that kind of takes me to the summaries part of this slide, because that's another thing you can use your weekly announcements for, is you can highlight some things that students have said in those discussion posts each week. And again, this is whether it's graded or not. You can highlight, you can say, well, April had a really good, or you might not put evaluative things on there, but you say, April stated this, and you might say, and Miranda added this. And similarly, Amber added this comment. Check those 3 out if you'd like a little bit more information. And then the next week, you might highlight Jessica and Chala and Karianne. So again, make sure you're not highlighting the same person every week, even if they are dynamic and wonderful. You want to make sure that you're bringing other people into the conversation. And remember that student motivation. It might seem kind of funny, but even when I'm joking about those gold stars, we kind of like getting things like that, a sticker on our paper. And when we're highlighted in those summaries, in those announcements, it feels like you got that sticker. And we say, oh, now I want to participate. I saw that they talked about Miranda. I want her to talk about me. So then they'll want to contribute a little bit more. And also, if you're highlighting those good examples, that adds to, I've given my instructor example of a good one. Now they have these other examples to look at. They'll recognize more how to write these discussion posts in a manner that contributes to the conversation. Does this make sense so far? Does it make discussion boards feel a little more doable? Not quite so daunting, at least? Okay. So, Karianne.
So now that we have thought about it some more, what positive aspects of group discussion boards can you imagine as you think about using them in a little bit of a different way? What benefits do you think they might have to your courses?
Feel free to unmute or to write it in the chat. We're open to either way.
Getting to know your students at a deeper level, certainly.
I think soliciting opinions and extra thoughts that aren't really tied to an assignment.
Students can find similarities with each other. Yep. Encouraging more active participation. Smaller groups making students feel less intimidated about participating. Exactly. And I think, sometimes you get surprised because the students who might participate more in a discussion board post might not be the students that might be talking in class. And, I always find that fun when you have that student who you're like, oh, they're really engaged in the material and they really have some great ideas. And if we didn't have this kind of written discussion board post, we wouldn't know about that. Not everyone is as chatty as Laura and I, like some people are quieter, but like to, write about it more. And then, yes, Jessica said, identifying areas that need further detail or clarification. That's really helpful too. I think when you realize, I was just mentioning this to a friend when I taught political science last semester, and I realized that still the students did not understand federal government structure. No matter, how much I explained it this one way, they didn't quite get it. Because if they can't express any kind of thoughtful ideas about it, that they don't really have that concept. So then, to go back and try to think about how you can teach that information in a different way. Yeah, these are all great.
Thank you for participating in that conversation.
Yeah.
All right. The very final thing, just to talk about our group projects. And this is just kind of briefly those considerations around it, because in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about those tools behind it, being able to offer you some new ideas for student collaboration too. But when you're thinking about those group projects, you want to think about the duration, and within that, Think about that scaffolding and detailed instructions. You might have students who haven't participated in group projects very often. And these are for your in-person or your online, but I see the value in D2L supporting some of that student collaboration or that ability for them to connect, as Charla was talking about. It might be the avenue that they need to help with some of those connections if they can't meet at the same time. So it's providing some of that scaffolding also. How do you work with other people? How do you contribute to a group? They might not necessarily understand how to do all of those things. So some of your students who feel like, oh, I always do all the work, they might. And some of the students who kind of sometimes skate, they might not skate because they're saying, oh, I'm just going to sit back. Sometimes they aren't contributing because they don't feel welcome. The group is too big. So they don't feel like they have a place. They don't have an assigned role, which we talked about roles. If you give me a job, now I have a reason to be there. Or sometimes they just aren't sure they have value in what they say. So they're nervous, they're scared. And admittedly, some of them say, oh, I'll let them do the work. But there's more of them who probably have those other reasons. But I want to encourage long-term projects. And I'm thinking, maybe 4 weeks. It depends on how long your course is. But if you're, let's say 4 weeks, let's pretend 4 weeks. Because then when we were talking about, when Charla had mentioned, for instance, scheduling difficulties that groups have, that gives them time to connect. That gives them time to actually complete this project. If you try to have them do projects in 1 week and they work and they have families and they're also taking 3 other courses, it can be really difficult. So helping recognize to be as inclusive as possible in the groups, that we do have all of these different obligations that our students have, but they're trying so hard to still participate well. If we understand that, we provide long-term. Now, however, the next part is thinking about those benchmarks though. And maybe there's a weekly check-in so that they're still on task, so they don't get to week 4 and go, oh, we haven't done anything and we have 2 hours to complete it. You're helping them think about it. And it can be a weekly reflection that they just post to a discussion board. Or it can be a weekly check-in, based by email or response to you. Maybe it's one of those little surveys. And if you want more help with surveys, we have that too. But it can be a little survey that you can post out to them that says, how is the group going? How is your contribution? Things like that. So you can also get a feel, because maybe that group needs some scaffolding. How do you work better together? How do you accept ideas of others? Things like that. So those are the ways to be able to look at those projects to help them be a little more approachable. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about some additional tools that might be really useful, like, Jamboards, a Google Suite, and even Google Maps. I'm so excited about showing you about that. But any thoughts on project duration? Because this is going to be where we're wrapping it up next.
So I kind of have a question about that, because that's one of the challenges. We have a group project in our Principles of Management course that is used for SLOA, and it is a really good project. Like, it's kind of multi-part, and it's easy for them to divide into different sections. So everybody's got a role, and then we had them do it as a presentation. So everybody's kind of working together and responsible. But one of the kind of the drawbacks on the long-term project is people sticking through the class. You always have people falling off. And so then what we have are, groups that were set up to be 4 that may end up being 2. And then you've got 2 people trying to do the work of the 4. And so then there's frustration on the part of students. Well, why do I have to do all this? And that wasn't my part, and or I just do it by myself. So we were kind of thinking about they're redesigning that course for the Title III, which is going to be a 7-week course. So then we have even less time. And I don't we're nervous about and trying to think what's going to be the best approach. So we thought maybe just a 2-week project. Okay, you guys are responsible for doing this, but then that kind of also goes against then there's not the time allotted to develop a rapport between the students and kind of define all the roles and do the work. So any suggestions?
Well, that might be a great place for those benchmarks, so that you're able to check in. You might also differentiate the assignment. When I'm saying that is, think about, what does it look like if there are 4 people in the group? What does it look like if there were 3 people? And what does it look like if there were 2? That you have the idea in kind of a lot of courses, and your Title IIIs will have this too. There's an instructor guide that might have those ideas to help kind of rethink that if there are fewer members of the group, then how might those responsibilities change so that their product might end up being a little bit different by the end also, but still be complete enough that you feel that it has accomplished your goals. But those benchmarks, those weekly check-ins might be a really useful thing if you can have it be kind of cumulative. So that now, well, we've created this part, and I don't know if you might already have that in place, something like that already. But that's another way to be able to approach something like that. You're right, you'll have a shorter duration for it. The only thing I caution against like a 2-week project, again, is helping those students have that opportunity to connect. So if you're able to chunk those pieces of your larger project that you feel might be more meaningful, then into those smaller pieces, then even if you lose people in a 7-week course, I'm hoping you lose fewer people too, that they have the ability to stick to it for the 7 weeks, because we know life half the time when students drop out, it's because life, it's not any other reason. So hopefully life is consistent enough for them for the 7 weeks to be able to do that. If you want to continue to brainstorm that, email me, Chala, too, and we'll brainstorm some ideas too. Well, and I know that Hillary's working with Title III too, but I don't see her here anymore.
Right.
She must have to go.
Yeah, she hopped off. She had a Title III meeting. But I was thinking too, I know, what if you had, almost thinking about like in science when we do lab reports. So when you do a lab report in science, you do the lab, you physically do the lab as a group, but each person writes their own lab report. And so you have results that you share, but then each person produces their own product. So I wonder if that might be an idea too, where there's a portion of the project that's shared, maybe the research, or maybe some sort of product that they come up with that's shared, but then each person submits their own individual assignment that would have their own introduction, their own, conclusion. And maybe, if you wanted to have included, then reflection on working in the group as part of that assignment. Because that way it's a little bit less reliant on the group to function. When we're here as employees, like we're all getting paid. So most of us can function as a group. Not always, but most of us can function as a group. But with the students, I know exactly what you're talking about, Chala, that there is those students that just fall off.
Yeah.
So at least this would be less heavy lifting for the whole group.
Yeah. And if I can,
and that depends on your assignment. Oh, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. For SLOA purposes, if you're talking about the collaboration assessment, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
A lot of programs don't use a longer term project. They use something that only takes one class period or a shorter period of time. So that way you avoid that particular situation. There's nothing that says that it has to be a long-term project to assess collaboration skills.
Right. Thanks.
That's good.
And that's an excellent thought too, Robin. Thank you for adding that, because if you can do it within that course meeting, then the students are there. So that helps with that connection issue that you saw, Chala. So again, I think it depends on what your outcomes are. And maybe you have a couple that are establishing that collaboration that are, a single course, and maybe you have a longer project that can complement as well. But I like that Robin gave you alternatives so that you can still meet that goal with something that's maybe a shorter term, but then you can also, have that longer term and you don't miss it for all the students. Great. Yeah, I love these ideas.
and if you have a strictly online asynchronous course, you can also make that a shorter period of time, like do it only over a 1-week period, maybe later in the semester after whoever is going to shake out of the course has shaken out.
Yeah. We did talk about doing that, like don't do it in the first, 2 weeks. Like, let's wait a minute to assign our groups to kind of make sure at least they seem like they're going to be active in there. It's just a matter of trying to make it, valuable, informative, and collaborative. And also, we do it for the SLOA purpose, but we also do it for the purpose of the CCC, which is to help students to be able to collaborate. And I think even more so now than ever, because they're all used to, this is all I do is I go on and I do my work. I don't talk to anybody.
Right.
And they're like, I shouldn't have to collaborate. This is stupid. And you hear it all the time.
Well, and I think that comes back to the real world, one big part of student motivation is, am I going to have to do this in the real world? And we can certainly all testify that none of us get to work in a vacuum. We all have to work with team, with team members from across the state. And so it's not something, when you go into the real world, business, biology, math, no matter where you are, you're going to have to work as part of a team. So, better to practice those skills now than to be lost when your boss tells you, okay, the three of you have to go and figure this out.
Research shows that more people lose their jobs because they don't know how to work with people, not because you don't know how to do the job, because they'll teach you how to do the job. But if you can't work with others, because I used to teach students who had emotional disturbances, if you can't work with others, if you can't learn how to work in a group, you're more likely to lose your job than you are if I need to teach you a skill. All right, here we go. Oops, click. And so here's our summary. Yay! These are the things we talked about today. We talked about online work, how we can make groups in D2L, discussion boards, and project durations. So we want to thank you, and we'd like to invite you to go forth and enjoy grouping for online work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming today, and thanks for participating. Yay!